So about a month or so ago, we witnessed about 11 members of Congress deciding to drop off 2 letters to representatives of the United States Trade Commission, wanting to talk about what Sony has been doing to Microsoft and other Western game developers over in the Japanese market. And now it appears that not only has a third letter been dropped off, but also now we are seeing members of Congress deciding to grill the FTC a little bit about why it appears that they're protecting Sony. But let's just start at the top before we dig into the real meat and potatoes. Let's just talk about what has got us here real quick. Obviously, Sony is the game industry leader, and they have been using their leadership in gaming to systematically raise the price of games, raise the price of hardware, institute concepts like charging for next-gen upgrades and charging developers what we have referred to as the Crossplay Tax. If you want to make a game with crossplay so other people can play on other consoles with each other, Sony has a tax for that. Yes, Sony is the market leader. They have led the market to raise these prices. That's what kind of sucks when you are the first person to raise your prices, is if you're the market leader, generally everybody follows suit, and people are starting to take notice to that. And when it comes to how much Sony has been pushing the industry, let's talk about how they've been pushing Xbox. We have seen over the years that they have essentially pushed Xbox into a corner. They have been extremely hard on Xbox with blocking stuff from coming to their platform. We all remember when, Sony, hey, here, this is how we, share our games. Sony has been uberly aggressive over the years with Microsoft, and people have been applauding that. But now it appears that that aggressiveness might actually backfire and bite them in the ass a little bit. They also possibly lobbied just a little bit too much over the Activision Blizzard deal with Microsoft Xbox. And one thing that senators are also starting to point out is that Sony's real lobbying and complaining and crying about the whole Activision buyout didn't really take place until after Sony's buyout of Bungie was finished, and then they started the lobbying. It's almost people are trying to say that Sony is setting a double standard, that it is okay for us to make a purchase, but it's okay for them to not make a purchase. Or it's Sony trying to say that, well, we couldn't afford that, so we don't want them to have it either. Things are going to start taking a little bit of a different turn. And it started with how Sony went to the FTC and these other world regulators on how they wanted the gaming market defined. They wanted to somehow convince world regulators that Sony is going to not be able to recover from this. So Sony helped world regulators with the CMA, the EU, and especially the FTC coming up with this half-assed, harebrained idea that the only real competitors in high-end game consoles are Xbox and PlayStation. PlayStation did not want the Steam Deck included in that, Nintendo, PC, they wanted it to be exclusively PlayStation and Xbox. And when they define the market by those standards, by Sony standards, the market is defined as such that they have a 98% market share over in Japan. And this is what has led senators to all of a sudden turn their heads and be like, well, what the hell, Sony? If you want the market defined like this, then let's talk about you having essentially a monopoly on the Eastern Japanese market. And it's actually affecting the Western gaming development companies and the Western gaming markets. So that is where Xbox and other US game developers have no real presence in Japan, despite being in the Japanese economy for over 20 years. This is starting to be highlighted in some of these letters, especially the third one that just came out. And then also they're wanting to talk about how Sony is paying to keep Western game industry out of Japan, violating antitrust laws by paying to have developers and publishers not develop for Xbox specifically. And also it seems that they are not advertising right on the Sony console over there. A lot of game developers from this part of the United States suffer in sales because Sony does not push some of these titles as heavy as they do other ones, and they're wanting the Federal Trade Commission over in Japan to start discussing these issues with Sony. And some have even accused some of these senators on being Microsoft's payroll. But the ironic part is the only senator that has actually assumed any kind of money from Microsoft on any real level. She has actually taken in over $527,000 campaign contribution dollars over the course of 30 years. Broken down, I think the math was somewhere around $17,000 a year. So a congressman that makes about a couple $1 million a year totally sold their soul for an extra $17,000. I think not. But it keeps going into deeper than that now the complaints are still coming in. As we saw, Senator Kevin Kramer has written a letter to Sony CEO Mr. Yoshida about the company's anti-competitive behavior and has requested information about how the company acts in the market. If you actually look at his request, there is some really crazy stuff in there. He actually has no real merit or any grounds to ask for some of the stuff that he did. So I don't really see him getting a lot of the information he has requested. But at the same time, this is a third letter that is now being submitted to Sony, and this isn't just going to go away for them, especially with the letter stating that Sony's conduct hurts American consumers by leading to higher prices and reduced choice. Importantly, it also constrains economic opportunities for developers, including for small and independent developers. It goes back to what I was saying about Sony has raised prices in the game industry because they are Sony. They have actually shunned and stunted independent game developers' spotlight or organic findings on the PlayStation Network stores for bigger blockbuster titles and other companies like Square Enix. And that is where the Square Enix deal actually is also coming up in this. Like, they are talking about by Sony keeping games like Final Fantasy off of the Xbox hardware, they're stunting the growth of the Xbox hardware in that economy. So it's going to be very interesting to see in the long run if Sony's going to be able to keep up and keep doing some of the tactics that they have been. And then we just saw the FTC get grilled at a meeting with members of Congress. Let's check out that video right now before we dive into it any further.
I say we can all agree that competition law isn't supposed to protect an industry's dominant player.
Correct.
In light of that, I find it curious that the FTC is taking action to protect Sony, which has 68% of the global market for high-end video gaming consoles, from competition attempted to block Microsoft's proposal or their proposed acquisition of Activision Blizzard King. As you know, Sony's been the most vocal opponent of that deal, and remarkably, the FTC has sided with Sony. Can you explain why that seems to be a good idea?
This case also has been voted out and is in administrative proceedings, so I'll let the complaint speak for itself. Mm-hmm. I will say, as a general matter, we always really benefit from hearing market participants across the board, including big players. But at the end of the day, we always make our own independent judgments based on the law and the facts.
And looking at this video, we see that now members of Congress are wanting to openly discuss this situation with the FTC, which means that they are also wanting to discuss this situation with the Japanese Federal Trade Commission. Now, a lot of people might just see this as a non-issue for Sony, but this is probably going to start growing into a bigger issue than just a non-issue. It may not be earth-shattering at first. We'll see how things go in the future. But Sony is definitely going to feel the pressure for some of their past business tactics that have suppressed competition away from Western growth in that economy. And that actually does violate an agreement between the United States and Japan that they are not supposed to be doing stuff like that. So Sony, in the long run, this could create a little bit of a change in the gaming industry as a whole, not just for Sony. Sony may have to support Western developers more in the future by helping promote their products in the Japan gaming economy, and Sony also may not be able to pay for blocking rights or other suppressive tactics in the future. And they also could create a situation that Sony may not be allowed to consistently buy exclusive rights to Japanese third-party developer games, kind of like with Square Enix. So will this force Sony's hand to start snatching up Japanese developers to make them exclusive studios to kind of loophole themselves around that? Will we finally see, them pull the trigger on buying Square Enix? I did say that in a previous video. About how that's the one thing that could get Sony out of some of these situations if they just buy these developers outright and make them first party. But if that does not take place, in the long run, we could see a little bit more of a level playing field in the gaming industry, especially when it comes to how the big three, Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation, compete with each other, because Sony might not be allowed to use some of the same tactics that they have been since about 2013, and that is suppressing games, paying for blocking rights, and just outright trying to use suppressive tactics to crush the competition. And now this will probably create a situation for Sony in the long run that they might have to answer to the powers that be over in their home country on that. They might need to start changing some of their tactics to help promote better trade between the United States and Japan, because at the end of the day, that obviously these two countries have entered into an agreement, and Sony is not above having to listen to the powers that be that tell them what to do at the end of the day. So tell me down in the comment section, everybody, what do you think about this whole situation? Do we continue thinking this is going to be a non-issue for Sony, or do you think this is going to potentially grow into something bigger as time goes on, especially if the FTC continues down the path of trying to block the deal, and with Sony still continuously trying to lobby against the deal? Could this actually completely backfire on Sony at this point and have all their screaming and crying and yelling to world regulators may have turned the wrong heads in the wrong direction for Sony? I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you like today's content, please like and subscribe, all that fun stuff down below that YouTube likes to see. Please stay tuned for more content like this. I am going to be doing a little bit of a follow-up video coming up on what exactly is going on in the FTC when it comes to this whole situation with Sony. Also, be sure to check out the end card and check out some of my previous videos. Again, everybody, I am Centurion1307. You have yourselves a good day. Until next time, stay safe out there.